and well-informed and great group of people who have offered to give us their time to talk about comics as a medium, but and what they mean to everybody, not just ourselves. So I'm going to let each person introduce themselves, and I don't think everybody's in the same order. So I'll say your name and let you introduce yourself one at a time. Randy, I think you have the most experience with this, so I will let you begin.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Randy Duncan. I'm a professor and the director of the Center for Comic Studies at Henderson State University. I teach a number of the courses in our minor in comic studies, and I write and edit books about comic books. So that's the short version.
All right, and following that, Corbin, if you'll introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Corbin. I am a designer / quasi illustrator for a local startup based out of Little Rock called Apogee. Graduated just a couple of years ago and have just been teaching myself a lot about design, illustration, and sequential art as a whole.
Fantastic. Next up, Jess Carson.
Hello, my name's Jess Carson. I'm writer-director, born and raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm currently out in LA writing for The Flash, working on a couple other projects, including a limited series and a feature, and I'm excited to be here.
All right. And last but certainly not least, James Harris.
Hey, I'm James. I'm the owner of Retrograde Comics here in Little Rock. Born and bred in Arkansas. Was formerly a child psychotherapist. Still got my license and everything, but I'm selling funny books now.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you again, guys, so much for being here. Really excited to talk with all of you, hear a lot of what you have to say tonight. But before we get into the actual panel part of our discussion, I've asked Randy to get a presentation ready for us about comics in the places that you might not expect to see them. So Randy, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Let's see, why is it not now showing me?
Oh no.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Sorry about that. That's why it wasn't showing me anything. It skipped to the last slide. Okay, so most people, so I just had a noisy car go by for my introduction. So most people who don't read comics think of them as this, superhero stories. They're mainly for kids. Or if they've seen some really goofy comics, like some of the old Jimmy Olsen comics, they may not have a high opinion of comics. Let's hope they've never seen this. There are many Captain Marvel characters in comics history, but this is the weirdest one, a robot from another planet who, when he says split, his limbs come apart, operate independently, and when he says zam, they come back together. He has about 12 other powers in addition to that. So it's easy to not take comic books seriously if this is kind of what you think of. But one person who took them seriously almost from the time he got involved was Will Eisner. And he started in the late 30s as a teenager when the comics industry was still young. He at first churned out a bunch of quickly done comics for the new publishers that kept cropping up. But then he got a chance to produce the Spirit comic book and have pretty much creative control. And he started to experiment with it, started to explore the potential of the art form. And so many artists that followed him kind of learned how to do comics from reading the Spirit. But after a decade of doing the Spirit, he took what he had learned and he started making educational, informational comics for corporations and the government and making a ton of money. So after about 20 years of doing that, he wanted to come back into creating some narrative comics. And so he put together a collection of short stories, and he was had never been connected, except for those very early days, to the comic book industry. So he went to mainstream comic book publishers, tried to sell them on the idea of publishing this, and he thought it would be good marketing to tell them it was a graphic novel. Now, he wasn't the first person to use that term, but we don't have time to go into all that. But it's also not a graphic novel. It's a collection of short stories. But it was quite a bit different than what most people thought of as comics, because you have someone railing against God because he felt like they had this agreement that if he became a better person, and he adopted this young girl, things would work out. But the girl dies, and he has a crisis of faith. And this book was done after Will Eisner's daughter died, like at 15 years old, from leukemia. So a very personal story, almost therapeutic in some ways. So it kind of set up moving toward more serious graphic novels. And then in the rest of his life, Will Eisner produced a series of graphic novels, all of which, some are better than others, but all of which are worth taking a look at. These are two of my favorite, A Life Force and To the Heart of the Storm. Now, I mentioned he did educational comics. One of the things that one of the really lucrative contracts was with the Army to do a magazine that explained to troops how to maintain their equipment and use comics form to educate them about that. So let's look at comics that are used to educate. We're all familiar with those. We've probably read this about what to do if the plane crashes, what to do if we catch on fire. And actually, Scott McCloud, who did his own educational comic, Understanding Comics, he likes to collect those in case of fire signs at hotels, take pictures of them, and find the really goofy ones that would pretty much assure that you're going to burn to death if you try to follow the instructions. But there's been a variety of educational sorts of comics. Golden Legacy Comics is, and you can still find the site online. I think maybe you still order these, but devoted to biographies of important African Americans that many times were overlooked. The guy named Malcolm Adder, who made a career out of doing comics for politicians and for the government, he went to the Republican National Committee and asked them if they wanted a Dewey comic book, and they said, no, that's ridiculous. So he went to the Democrats, and they were kind of desperate because they didn't think they were going to win. And they, well, sure, do a story of Harry S. Truman. When Truman surprisingly won, in an interview later, his campaign manager said, I think that comic book might have put us over the top in Ohio. So that got Malcolm Adder lots of jobs. This is one that's much later he did that was a propaganda comic for the CIA, explaining to the people of Grenada how happy they should be that the U.S. Forces had come in and liberated them, had rescued them from rape and slavery, as it says below. The Federal Reserve has done comic books to explain what they're all about. So if you are trying to interest some young person in your life in comics, just give them a copy of The Story of Checks and Electronic Payments, and I bet they'll be hooked. Here's a weird one. This was Canadian comic done by someone who was a tax preparer and didn't like all the new taxes that were being added into it. I know it's kind of hard to see that art blown up. It's a little fuzzy, but basically the Minister of Finance just wants to tax everything. And the more he thinks about taxing people, the more he turns into this monster. And the tax preparer has to become Captain Tax Time to save the middle class and the lower class that are burdened by taxes. The NAACP did a series of comics during the 60s that, in this one, on the street where you live, is telling people how they might improve their communities. And so it's telling African American communities, you know, the best way to get things done, register to vote. And so later in the comic, it shows us once a lot of people in the community are registered, what do you know? A politician shows up saying, what can I do for you? You know, and it's he's a very stereotypical looking politician and there's very stereotypical dialogue. I'm not sure they should trust this guy, but you know, at the end, he's like, I just want to know what I can do for you. I'm your friend. There was the don't ask, don't tell policy for people who are gay in the military. They created a comic book to educate people about how to deal with that. And so it's partly telling you, don't tell us. And it's also, there's one part that says, if you want to get out of the military, you can't just claim you're gay. We're going to investigate that and find out if you really are. But it's also, it's pretty much like a textbook. And so like you can see on the page about harassment, it's got learning objectives. After you've read this little segment, you'll know, how to do this. I think one of the best educational comic series, and it's not just one ongoing series, but anyway, Larry Gonek's comics. He started with like math and went into other sciences, but he's got some wonderful history comics in it. And he's been doing that for decades, and maybe one of the best-selling comics creators that no one knows. And Jim Attiavani has been doing that more contemporaneously with comics that are about science, sometimes biographies of scientists. Right? But you can find comic books that explain philosophy in comics form. You can find a comic book that explains the history of comic books in comic book form. But probably the comics that most people are familiar with through maybe a school setting, if you've had to read a comic in college for an English class, it was probably a memoir comic and quite possibly one of these, what I call the big three. So I see Corbin nodding that, that he might at some point have been assigned to read Persepolis, Fun Home, or Mouse. I think now it's the big four because people have added March to that, which kind of makes it the big six because March is in 3 volumes. And you probably know it was co-authored by the late Congressman John Lewis, but it was drawn by North Little Rock native Nate Powell. So we've got a local connection to this graphic novel that won the National Book Award. But there's memoirs about all kinds of things. Here's 2 very good ones about families leaving Vietnam at the end of the Vietnam War, coming to America, trying to establish themselves. Very different tone and experience, but both very interesting graphic novels. So there's, you may be thinking, well, what about one that's right for my age? Well, if you're middle-aged and you're starting to talk to your parents about elder care, then maybe Roz Chast's Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? For teenagers, it's a beautifully done coming-of-age story that Craig Thompson does in Blankets. Also a wonderful use of the comics form. For younger teens, pretty much anything by Raina Telgemeier, especially Smile, something that I want to share with people in that age group. Then there's comics that have been in journalistic form. Joe Sacco led the way with that, with Palestine, which he started out more as memoir and became more growing into a reporter. By the time he did Footnotes in Gaza, it's definitely journalism in comics form. Some magazines and even the Foreign Policy Journal hired him to go and cover contemporary events in comics form, such as the Bosnian war crimes. So if you want to read that kind of journalism, there's a book called Journalism that collects his short journalism pieces. AD is about the after effect of Hurricane Katrina. And what Josh Neufeld did is he interviewed 5 people who had 5 very different experiences in the wake of that hurricane. The Nib online is also a good place to find comics journalism. And Andy Warner, who does mostly digital comics, is producing some really interesting things there on contemporary issues. And there's some that maybe aren't reporting and might fall more into documentary comics. The Influencing Machine, Brooke Gladstone, who does On the Media for NPR, did this one with Josh Neufeld. Here's one about a Arkansas landmark, the Crescent Hotel, that Northwest Arkansas artist Sean Fitzgibbon is doing. And so hopefully that will be published soon. So do I have time to run through a few examples of other comics that?
Yeah, this is great. If you have some more examples you want to run through, please do.
Okay, just real quick, a couple of wordless comics that people might consider. Wordless comics really require you to do a lot of thinking. A beautiful one is The Arrival by Sean Tan. It's kind of a universal immigrant experience because it's not set in any real place, as you can see. Sometimes it uses visual metaphor, like on the right. Sometimes it still, I guess, visual metaphor, but evocative of real world places. Just a great book. One of my favorites is Asterios Polyp, and that's partly because it plays with the form so much and tells the story in a very interesting way. Saga, if you like science fiction, if you like epic adventure, if you like love stories, you can get all of that in Saga. Monstrous is epic fantasy, high fantasy with absolutely beautiful artwork. If you like crime fiction, then Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips have been doing wonderful stories in that genre for a while. Prior to Baghdad, if you remember during the war, during the bombing, there was damage to a zoo and some animals got loose in the city. And so this is kind of the war in Iraq from an animal perspective. Nimona, you can see, won a bunch of awards. Great book for young people. And especially for young girls, Marvel has introduced a lot of interesting new characters that for like early teens, Moon Girl and her pet dinosaur would be great. Maybe for a little bit older teens, Wasp and Ironheart. Riri Williams is a girl genius who creates her own Iron Man type of armor. And then there's Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel. And not to leave DC out, they are doing some versions of their characters that are not at all the classic version. And this issue of Supergirl is essentially a story about feeling like you're different when you're in high school, which is kind of everybody's high school experience. And so, you know, no costume in it ever. And there's a series of graphic novels DC is doing like that, with totally reimagining their characters just for young adult novels. And Marvel's starting to get into that now too. And so they got one with Miles Morales, Spider-Man. And a local example that's good for young readers is Eve of the Ozarks by Gustav Carlson, an Arkansas native. So celebrate Will Eisner Week. Graphic novel.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Corbin. That was awesome. I had, there's so much information on that I thought was really, really useful, and so many things I hadn't heard of. And thank you so much for putting that together for us, because, that was one of the purposes I think of this, is to show how varied comics can be and help people understand that.
And James will sell you many of those if you will.
And
Absolutely.
he has sold me many of those. I'm broke now. Thanks, James. So from here, now we're going to take everybody in the whole panel, and we're going to go over some discussion questions. And I'm actually going to go ahead and start off with probably the most open one. That can, one thing I liked about our panelists not knowing each other well enough that y'all probably communicated outside of this panel was that the phrase "comics are for everyone" can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and depending on your background. And so I really wanted to hear what each of you as individuals thought of that phrase. So that's our first question is, and discussion topic is, so comics are for everyone. What does that phrase mean to you? And I'm going to go ahead and start with the order that I have on my screen with Corbin. And Corbin, I'll let you begin, and the others can feel free to chime in, and then I'll keep us moved around.
So to me, the phrase "comics are for everyone" really means beyond the idea that there's a wide age range of potential appeal for comics. So like we were showing, like there's a bunch of stuff from like people who are like preteens to people who are like, they're empty nesters. They don't even have kids anymore. They're like 60 plus. That there's also comics for a lot of us in a lot of the junctions in our lives. So if you're someone who's struggling with identity, if you're someone who's having some kind of issue with mental health, like you're struggling with depression, there's a story that you can relate to for that. And the fact that the format is so much more open and accessible for those experiences and that information, and just that ability that there's a home base that people can talk to about it, and that they can say, oh, like when you read this, like what'd you think about this? And it's a really easy way to open up doors of conversation that culturally might be a little bit hard to push. Yeah, that's what it means to me.
All right. I think that's a fantastic answer. Randy, you want to follow up that?
Well, two things come to mind. There's a visual in Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics where he's got the empty picture and he says comics, are a form in which you can pour anything. And I think it was like Harvey Picard said, you can do anything in a comic. It's in some ways more flexible than film or television. Even though you can do anything there, sometimes you need 150 people involved in the special effects in order to do it. But I really think that one thing that makes comics for everyone, and a lot of people don't realize this because they think, oh, I don't like to read things with pictures, is it's such an involving medium because it's just these little squares of still pictures. And while a movie or TV show, you sit there and it does the work, you're doing the work of making the meaning in a comic. And I don't think people who haven't read comics realize how that's kind of addictive in a way. It draws you in and you're kind of more involved with the form than you realize you're going to have to be.
Yeah.
Agreed. Absolutely. Jess, what's your take?
Yeah, for me, that phrase really means that, there's so many different ways to get into this format. There's so many different types of people, as it's been said, that this format's meant for, and there's so many different ways to digest this format. And I think that's kind of cool because that means it's accessible. That means, anyone can get into it in any kind of way. And I think that's the thing that's gonna, always be present within comics and graphic novels and things of that nature.
Yeah.
All right. James, do you have anything to add to that? I feel like they've covered so much.
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot from people about how, the mainstream stuff, Marvel, DC, is really hard to get into these days because of the mountains of continuity and backstory and everything that, people feel like they need to know to start. But there's some pretty good jumping on points here recently. But one thing I've noticed is that whenever somebody comes in and they're looking for something to read, we've had a very good response to indie comics. Indie comics are really diverse. They offer a lot of different types of stories, and they really kind of speak to a different type of reader than what is traditionally those folks that traditionally come into comic book stores. And we've been kind of lucky with that. I mean, right now we've had people, wanting, history-based books, a lot of LGBT material. We've really kind of, been able to hook up people with what they want. So, if you're coming into a comic book, or a comic book store, don't ever just assume that it's going to be a bunch of guys wearing Green Lantern t-shirts and it can be something different.
Excellent. And we've actually got a couple questions based on that we'll come around to at the end that were really good. I'll address with you guys. So here.
Green Lantern.
Yeah, not that there's anything wrong with Green Lantern. He's great. All the Green Lanterns are great.
I didn't overstep myself there.
Someone out there is upset, like, Green Lantern's my hero. I love Ryan Reynolds. So you guys kind of covered a little bit of, the next topic I was wanting to talk about, and that, in Professor Duncan, you did too, talking to us about the history of like comics outside of the general understanding of what they usually are, is that they're for children and that it's all superheroes. So is there a time that you can remember when maybe that was your understanding of it, and what helped you understand that comic books were more than just children's books, and more than children's books and more than superheroes? Do you remember like when that came about for you? And we can go in the same order and start with Corbin.
So surprisingly, my first exposure, well, unsurprisingly, I guess my first exposure with comics was the Sunday Funnies, back when that was still a thing and newspapers were like going extinct left and right. I explicitly remember a lot of I always responded really well to the Zits. I can't remember the creator for that. Just stylistically, it was always really great. I've actually, for most of my life, I've actually bounced off of superhero stuff. And I think this kind of harkens back to what we talked to before. It's the work can be objectively good, but subjectively it's just not for me. And that's totally fine. I found that after trying and getting into like the old, like all the black and white collections of Spider-Man and X-Men and all that stuff, I was like, stuff like Mouse is like, that's just the stuff I enjoy. I enjoy stuff that's much more ingrained in the human experience, and that I can really absorb someone else's like knowledge and wisdom and like everything that they've gone through. And that's just what makes it like so appealing to me. And that's like the stuff I really have to sometimes have to hunt for it, but to me, that's what makes the work fulfilling. And it took me a while to realize that that work really exists out there, because everybody talks about superheroes, which I get, like the artwork of them is like, top notch, like the best stuff, generally. But there is so much more out there.
All right, Randy.
Well, I was about 8 years old, I think, when I read my first comic book, a coverless copy of Adventure Comics with the Legion of Superheroes, which I found out later in life was written by a 13-year-old Jim Shooter. So this just really resonated with me, It was at my level. But I was kind of lucky that comic books and I literally grew up together. So as I was ready for something maybe a little bit different, Green Lantern, Green Arrow comes along, and is a different take on superhero comics as they go across the country, dealing with social issues. And then, when I'm getting a little bit older and want something a little more challenging, Alan Moore comes along and starts doing interesting things on Swamp Thing. And then there's, 1986 and Watchmen and Mouse and Dark Knight Returns. And then I also discovered Eisner a little bit late and went back and realized some of those graphic novels that he'd started doing. So yeah, I just, I don't know that there's a point where I discovered it, because it's just as I had needs for certain types of comic books, people were making them. And I've gotten much more into non-fiction comics, I guess, partly because I wrote a book about it, but I teach rhetoric is my main thing. And so I'm looking at comics as a form of persuasion. And that interests me. And so I'm seeking out things that do that.
Yeah, I can imagine writing your own nonfiction about comics would bring you to a place where you would be reading a lot of nonfiction about it. Jessica.
Yeah, I think I definitely, my foray was pretty traditional, reading some Batman stuff, but I'm a bit of a dark and twisty human, so I ended up eventually finding my way to things like Umbrella Academy and The Old Guard and 300 and Sin City, and I was like, oh, I like this. Let me find more of these. And that kind of, ended up being a really big jumping point into me about the actual range in story types and maturity levels and things of that nature that the world of comics has.
Those are some of my favorites too. That's like, I always liked superheroes growing up, but some of those I was like, oh, they can do this. They made books about this. James, what do you?
Whenever I was a kid, we had very little access to comics. I lived in a very rural area, and the only place you could get comics was at the grocery store. And a friend of mine his dad was a manager there, and he always kept GI Joe comics for his son coming in, and um, I would befriend him, and we really got into the GI Joe stuff. As I got older, we had a local library that had a lot of comics in it, and some of the books that you guys have been listing, Mouse, Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, stuff like that was all there. So we were, I was lucky to have that more than anything. And I mean, I don't think I ever visited a comic book store until I was, gosh, in high school, maybe. I mean, owning a comic book store now is like, a dream, considering, how difficult it was to get to this stuff when I was younger.
Yeah, you're living my dream. Rub it in my face. Oh man, maybe one day. So this, your first, interactions and your interactions with specific things that you liked kind of leads into our next question of, so if somebody off the street, it could be a friend. And so, this could be a pretty wide ranging question, but if you were going to, how would you approach introducing comics and sequential art to somebody else? And preferably someone who doesn't have experience, or even maybe somebody who's not interested in it because of their misunderstandings of the medium. Corbin? Corbin, I'll start. I promise I'll start. I'll go around some next time. I feel like I've been putting you on front street.
Oh no, it's fine. I don't mind. Pressure's okay.
Yeah.
I really wouldn't do anything special, honestly. So like I would treat it as like if I'm recommending anything else, like you really need to you need to have a good idea of like the general kind of media that the person is apt to consume. So like a band I like is Nine Inch Nails. I'm probably not gonna like Supergirl. Like there's going to be some correlations in terms of like there's like kinds of vibes to stuff that it's really going to they're going to really be able to lean into, or they're going to have a hard time dipping their toes in. If it's just like a stranger and like I have to suggest something, like I would be like, okay, I'm gonna pick what I would subjectively say is like the top out of like a couple of different kinds of categories, and just go in, read the first couple of pages. If you don't like it, put it down. Maybe ask the person who owns the store for a suggestion if you're having trouble finding something, because they're going to be far more knowledgeable about it than I'm ever going to be.
That's an excellent answer. I saw a lot of the panel nodding their heads. So what I might do is let the rest of the panel just kind of chime in and add to that as you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, for one of the things I've done is to, especially during periods of the year, whenever you have people coming in who aren't as likely to be into comics, we offer a starter box for folks. And what I like to do is we sort of put in books based on their interests. We can ask them, what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite TV show? What kind of stuff do you enjoy? And there's always an indie comic for just about anything. And we've that's always been kind of a good way of getting people started, because like I said, with a lot of the mainstream stuff, it's very continuity heavy. It can be a little bit intimidating at first. You can find some good, solid, self-contained stuff with the big two, but just ask folks, what are they into? What genre of entertainment do you like? Do you like crime movies? Do you like true crime TV shows? Science fiction? There's something for anybody.
I mean, I have this experience fairly often because about half the students who sign up for a comics course have never read comics. They're there because they've seen the superhero movies. So when I'm suggesting comics for them to read for assignments, I do exactly what everyone else was advising. Usually ask about movies first, and then novels that they want to read. I also every Christmas, most every Christmas, give my great nieces and nephews graphic novels, even though they don't want them. But and so I know a little bit about them, and so I keep thinking someday I'm going to give them that thing that's going to get them hooked.
Yeah, I feel you, Jess. I think they've definitely covered it really well. So you guys, and so for the next thing, some of y'all kind of covered this when talking about your experience with comics. But I think I'd really like to know, because I think these would be great suggestions for people to start. What is your favorite, and I actually put in the question I wrote to y'all, your favorite piece of sequential art, which is a term that Will Eisner used to refer to comics, that probably carries a little bit more artistic weight with it than saying comics, I think, in the general discourse. But what's your favorite piece of sequential art, and what about it speaks to you? How has this title impacted you? And so I'll swing around from the back this time and not put Corbin out on front, and start with James.
Okay. Yeah, that's a hard one. There's so many that, kind of come to mind. I would have to go probably with Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. I mean, that run is just incredible. Considering when it came about, I mean, it was just a sea change in the industry. Yeah, I would probably have to go with that.
All right, Jess.
I would have to note a specific run. So the Batman, A Death in the Family is probably something that really struck me in a way, because those were some of the first comics I read, and just coming off of watching the animated show in the 90s and then seeing the direction they took that run, really kind of both surprised and impacted me. And I was like, this is balls out storytelling. And so it's definitely, I'd say, very far up there on my list.
Randy.
Well, if we go broader to sequential art being comic strips, I guess Calvin and Hobbes, because I was a little boy with a big imagination, and so that was just wonderful. But if we're talking mostly about comics and graphic novels. I cheated and I put some of my answers in my presentation. So Asterios Polyp, because I do lots of analysis of form of comics, and I love a comic that plays with the form and uses it in imaginative ways. And so the symbolism of color and shape in that book is great. And there's, as far as lasting effect that it has, that's probably mostly a scene where there's a band that just played is kind of sitting with Asterios at a table in a bar, and I think there's like 4 or 5 guys and a woman there, and they're talking about relationships, and she finally, says something like, "Oh, for heaven's sake, let me show you." And she gets 3 coasters and leans them against each other, so they stand up in the middle of the table, and she says, "See, love, trust, respect. You take away any one of those, and the whole thing falls apart." And I thought that was just such a wonderful graphic, and timed so nicely in the comic, and how it's, she builds it, panel by panel. And so that's one of the things I often remember about that. Plus, I wrote a book chapter about Asterios Polyp, and I teach it a lot. So.
And I think by talking about Calvin and Hobbes earlier, I was like, everyone, I think in the panel, including myself, was like, oh yeah, that's my favorite. That's just good classic stuff. Corbin.
So unfortunately, you've now stolen my answer, Marcus. So yeah, mine is actually legit.
I'm so sorry.
No.
So
it's totally,
sorry.
it's like expected, right? Like you said. So it's, Calvin and Hobbes had a really significant impact on my life. I'd actually like to say it's actually design-wise influences my art even now. But because, so Bill Watterson, the guy who made it, he did a really fantastic job of blending escapism with imagination, but also like he's venting his internal discourse on the state of the world. I mean, it never feels like it's in your face. It just always feels really enjoyable. And that was a great place to kind of escape and relate, and just to like express a lot of my internal emotions, like to get relationship to that when I was growing up, because I was dealing with depression for about 13, 14 years. And his work was like, it is it's reliable. I know what I'm going to get. It's always going to be good. It's no matter how many times I look at it, I'm always enjoying it. It is like truly like timeless work in this medium for me. And it impacted me enough where I went to Columbus and I viewed what's called the Watterson deposit, where all of his physical work is stored. They deposited when he was just done. And I sat there for a whole day, just like looking through some of the selections and just like really analyzing what he did and learning like how he worked a little bit more than he would talk about it, but also just really, it was a very emotional experience for me. So like, it's always going to have a very special place for me. Now, if I have to say something besides like a comic strip, which is still sequential art, it's either going to be Mouse or it's going to be something called Unflattened by Nick Susanis, which was actually this dude's dissertation. And I read that probably once or twice every year because it's just like, it talks about how we communicate the human experience, the format of sequential art, how it all comes together, and why like life is just like the way it is. It's a very philosophical take on what a graphic novel can be. And I find that to be very, very interesting.
So Corbin, for people who don't know about the Billy Ireland Library and Museum, and who might be really interested in seeing some original artwork or doing research, could you tell them a little bit more about that?
So as like the process of it, or just like the experience?
What it is, what all they
so
have there.
Yeah, so the Billy Ireland Museum is an extension of the University of Columbus. They, like I said, they have literally every single piece, as far as I'm aware, that Bill Watterson ever made through the whole run of Calvin and Hobbes, which is 13, 14, a long time, very many years, a lot of work. I believe they have some on a permanent showcase, and they'll like rotate some pieces in and out as like a typical gallery setting, but they allow people to schedule a time that you're going to come in and you can say, I want pieces from these dates to look at, and you actually get the board that this guy inked on. And you can sit it, you have it in front of you, and like, there's an environment like you can't bring in cameras, you don't have pens, like you can't have any pens, you can have like a pencil and some paper. It's a very controlled environment, but it's very much like you're like if you went to a museum, you're like, I want to see archived work. It's not treated any differently because of the medium.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place. They also have the Will Eisner archives, all of his materials up there.
Yeah.
So a lot of other people as well.
Oh yeah. I was only able to be there for about a day and a half, so I didn't even have enough time to get through Watterson's work. So
a magical place.
Oh yeah, it's insane how much stuff is there.
You've given me a new vacation idea, so I appreciate you. My wife thanks you as well, I think. So I feel like for the next question that I gave you guys, I feel like we've kind of talked so much around that one. So I'm going to go to the last one because I've gotten some great audience questions that I really want to ask you guys about, some that are very specific to some of you. So the last question I wanted to cover is something I was thinking about when I was reading the beginning of the new Teen Titans from the 80s, where Robin is still wearing his short shorts and they're fighting demons and cultists. And so when I was reading that, I thought about this question, and it is, what is the maybe strangest comic or piece of sequential art that you've read or seen? James, start us off.
Don't know if people remember, but there was this guy who used to write tracts, like religious tracts. Yeah, I can't remember his name. Brandy,
Jack Chick.
Yep, that's him. I remember coming across one of his comics, strange in that you've just never seen anything like it. I mean, he was a very paranoid, very wacky guy. And in this particular one, it was about a town full of Satan worshipers. And they like kidnap a woman, and these two gung ho guys filled with the spirit come in and investigate and rescue her. I mean, it had cannibalism in it. It had weird allusions to these different rites and things, and it was so incredibly detailed in how it drew from biblical text and everything, and it was just drawn in this like incredibly creepy way. I mean, it was something. Yeah, I'll probably have to go with that one.
I grabbed the wrong mouse. That I've got two computers here. Jess, what is the strangest comic or sequential art that you've ever seen or read?
I'd say it's wild because it's now a mainstream, but like right before I graduated college, I picked up The Umbrella Academy, and I remember it being the strangest thing I'd ever seen in my life, with just kind of the way the events come to pass. And I ended up being really obsessed with Umbrella Academy. I was just really obsessed with that. And I remember thinking, especially because this is kind of the beginning age of when superhero movies started really becoming a thing, I was like, yeah, this is too strange for them to ever do it. It's so pure. They're never going to mess with Umbrella Academy. And lo and behold, some years later, Netflix decides to get with it.
Randy, I bet you have got something strange because I know you've read some stuff.
Actually, James took my first answer, but I've got backups. I put one of them in the presentation because Captain Tax Time, you're going to have to work hard to find something stranger than that. But that's kind of just a one-off that this guy did to promote his business. And so I might have to go with Cowboy Henk, Henk, which is a Belgian comic strip. That's a full page one, appeared in a newspaper, then I think later switched to a magazine. And it's very absurdist sort of things. Like one of them, he shows up he just knocks on some stranger's door, the woman opens it and he says, I need to come in and work on my watch. And then he's just got the watch on the table and a big hammer and a crowbar and, pieces are flying. And so you just never know what Cowboy Henk is gonna do. He's crossing a bridge and he sees a fish in the water and he dives in and pulls it out and tries to get it mouth to mouth because he thinks it's drowning, I guess. I don't know. They're often wordless, so you don't know. And he's this big burly guy with a square chin, and and it's pretty wild.
So I kind of already used my example of Unflattened for this. I do think it's weird because it's unexpected. I would say if I had to pick something else, so Craig Thompson wrote a book after Blankets called Carnet de Voyage. I'm probably butchering the name out of that. Some people may not say it's weird, but he just he kind of talks about like this internal dialogue and like the events that happen post Blankets and like some of like the difficulty of like it actually doing well, and like he struggles to find like meaning in his existence and in his work and in anything that he does. And it's like I loved it like from the get-go, but it was very raw in a way that like I wasn't used to like ever seeing someone talk about themselves on the page, because we have like most of us will probably have a tendency to butter things up a little bit, make it seem like it's not quite that bad because we don't want to come across as like I'm desperate, please help me. But I think that's what made it really, really good. And I like, even if I'd like, let's say I didn't like Blankets or I didn't like Habibi, I think this work alone would actually make me want to buy them to better understand like everything that he was feeling. And I don't think that there's a lot of works out there that have spoken to me like that. Yeah.
We actually, and Unflattened I thought was a good choice as well. Like we actually had a couple audience members asking about that. They're like, wait, what is that? I want to know more about that. So I think I think all of you guys have gotten some people thinking about some things they want to read. And we've had a couple say, well, I've got a reading list now to start. So from here, I'm going to go into some of the great questions that we've got. I'm going to try to go through as many of them as we can before we run out of time tonight. So I'm just going to kind of get into it. Some are directed at everyone, and some are a little bit more directed at specific people. Instead of kind of calling on you like I have been, like we're in class. If it's directed towards everybody, feel free to just chime in. So I am going to start with this one, which came up very early on when we were talking about comics are for everyone. They said that comics should be for everyone, but many women and girls find the local comic book shop environment too heavy with kind of like, and I think this is a fear that James had brought up with like nerd bro testosterone and people that make them feel uncomfortable. So, they want to get into comics, but maybe they had a bad experience. So what steps, and this is, directed a little bit more at James. So what steps do you think you could take to make your store feel safer and more inviting to female fans who maybe feel like they've been alienated from a bad comic book shop experience?
Yeah, one of the things I really tried to do whenever we set up our comic book store is to try to make it not really look like one so much. Our neighborhood is very much a reading neighborhood, and we've tried to kind of make it a more relaxed atmosphere. We don't have any, things hanging from the walls and Spider-Man hanging from the ceiling or whatever. We, one of the real secret weapons we have is that I have my wife here, and she's a fan too. I think that really kind of takes the edge off a lot with a lot of the female folks. You know, so many people have these stories about being ignored or kind of being just kind of made almost like made fun of or something. I mean, it's really a difficult thing for our industry right now. There's a lot of serious disagreement about stuff that happens online. Sacred cows are being changed, and that creates a lot of negative energy, especially when you have employees who are always talking about it or something like that. But we really try to set ours up that anybody can come in, be comfortable. We have a reading area, everything else. We give people time to look around and have asked, if they ask questions, we're there for them. But yeah, I'm really trying to make it different. So that's my motivation.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to add, or something that maybe you'd like to see a shop do to be as welcoming to all people as possible?
So I would say that the problem extends far beyond LCS, right? Like you were talking about, James. It's kind of a systemic issue as a result of what the industry was based off of on its values and what it pushed as its visual agenda. But I think a big part of it is just don't gatekeep. Just don't. There's no reason for it. And if you don't gatekeep, then there's nobody feels punished for their choices. And if I'm 30 years old and I read I only read YA novels, YA graphic novels, that's fine. That's my thing. And you shouldn't think anything less of someone because of their choice of reading material, just like you shouldn't think anything more of them because of their reading material. That's just their choice. And we should just support that they're doing something that they enjoy and nobody's being hurt by that decision. They're just happy. But I feel like sometimes that's asking a lot.
Yeah, I mean that's something that we hear all the time. I mean, my experiences with comic shops in the past has usually been I walk in, I might get a book, I bring it up to the counter, and somebody kind of gives you the side eye or something based on some silly argument that's playing out. yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be like Clerks, you know. That's the way I look at it. You know, we can all get along and enjoy what we want to. So
Absolutely. Excellent answer. Everybody, think no less or no more. It's what they enjoy. I think that was really well put, Corbin. So the next question I got from a night's member, it says, "Hi, Jess." So Jess, this is for you. They said that you were the first Black woman to write for the Flash television show. And as a BIPOC, do you feel more pressure to write more diverse characters?
Nope. Um, no, I think, that's, and I say it that way because it's kind of funny. It's kind of my brand out here, and when I'm working on my other projects as well, because it's not by any, oh, I'm trying to be inclusive. It's not by any, I'm trying to blah, 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 that I have certain characters in my works. It's because I live that life. Um, and so it's something that's very natural to me. It's something that's very, interesting to me. I write a lot of, one of my biggest genres, especially in my features, is grounded sci-fi. A lot of it takes place in the future. In the future, the world is going to look not just one way. So naturally, logically, I'm not going to write stuff just one way. And then, on the more blatant front, I'm a huge history buff. Anybody that knows me knows that if my hands fall off tomorrow, I will probably teach history somewhere. So I like to write historical fiction, and my historical fiction has to do particularly with characters of color who, especially when they're Black characters, they weren't slaves, because there are plenty of people in the past who did badass things who weren't slaves. So yeah, I would say it's definitely not something that's difficult. It's something that comes naturally to me. Is it a challenge in the industry I'm in? Yes, but kind of the same way that I would walk into a hostile comic book store and buy whatever the heck I want to. I'm going to be in the industry writing whatever I want to and making sure representation is there, because there are people like me who grew up not seeing themselves represented on screen. And then I'm going to do whatever I can to put a dent in that.
I love the quick note. That was that was great. Our next question actually had a couple people kind of asking, and this is a little bit for everybody, but it might be a little bit more towards James. But I want everyone to kind of give their input. How do you think that the pandemic has affected the comic book industry, and have publishers, or have you noticed anyone offering, any incentives or innovative incentives to bring old and new readers together?
The answer is unfortunately no. In the case of the big guys, you know, there was this huge shift with DC going with a different distributor that kind of knocked our feet out from under us during that time. Uh, it was good we were able to get comics, but it was kind of difficult to deal with in the midst of a 1 in 100 years pandemic. Uh, right now there is some stagnation with the big two. Uh, you know, I think that most of the help has come from the guys at Image. I know that Image Comics has been really working hard to get comics out there and to get people into comic shops. I know that Bad Idea, which is a new publisher, has been working on getting people into stores in a very organic way by saying that they're going to issue comics that are just comics. They're not going to be collections or anything else, and kind of reintroducing people to the idea of the single comic. It's kind of a different thing. Yeah, I mean, there was some disappointment on my part about how things were handled. The the best thing really is is to kind of remind people that we're around, and that didn't really happen too much. But you know, we're clipping on.
So the next question is probably my favorite question. It's a pretty heavy one. It's going to take a lot of thought. So if you need time to think about this one, please do so. But one of our viewers asked, "What is your favorite sound effect in a comic?"
Snicked.
I know the answer to that because I have a Spider-Man shirt that says "Fatang" on it in big letters, and so I see that all the time. So when I look in the mirror, so I guess that's going to have to be my favorite. Although I think actually my answer is a taxi cab stopping with this long screech that in one book that was Ken Busiak, I think, is the letterer who did that. He works with Howie Chaykin. Do I have that name right, James?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was when one of those Times Squared graphic novels, maybe, that Chaykin did. And so, yeah, that's a cool one.
Yeah, there's always really some creative ways they do sound. I'm a big fan of Nightcrawler. When he teleports, it's a bamf. It's just a fun thing to say. And James and said "snicked." I had an old Wolverine shirt with that on there. It's interesting how they make these sounds, and you're just like, I just read a sound. What is happening right now? And then to kind of go back to something we were talking about earlier. I just noticed the time. This will be our last question before we end tonight. But it was, do you think Marvel and DC may be running themselves out of relevancy in the conversation about comics by endlessly revamping and retconning? Also, if so, what do you see as the future of comics as a medium looking like? And what I'd like you to even answer or say, like, what would you like the future of comics as a medium to look like? And then that's to everybody.
Well, I guess for me, it would be, I hate to say this, if we're talking about the big boys, it would be less books probably. I mean, less books, more quality. And I think that, eventually continuity ends up being revamped. There needs to be more thought to creating contained storylines, trying to I hate to say write for a trade, but just kind of create something that can be digested in one sitting. I mean, that would be my thought on it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, the contained storylines. And like I showed some examples of the young adult novels that they're doing that are different takes on the character, but it's self-contained. But I think that kind of what I'd like to see for the future of comics is sort of what's happening now. We're getting those kinds of stories, but we're still continuing with the serialized comics, which I thought were going to end when my generation died. But I keep finding students who come along and they dive in and somehow they catch up. And I think those true believer comics, and things like that are kind of encouraging people to dip back into history. And so there's more continuity junkies coming along. So that may continue for a while. And at the same time that we're getting the self-contained stories and a vibrant independent comics and self-published. If anyone's ever gone to a small press expo, there's just lots of wonderful stuff there that's maybe only 75 people will ever read, but it's great to see someone creating that kind of stuff.
I'm like a bit of a fan of the chaos, I will wholeheartly admit. Selfishly so, obviously, because that's the kind of thing that keeps me paid. But on a serious note, I feel like there's and this has to strictly do with media and with other forms of media, you know, feeding off of comics. I feel like things like film and television are such an interesting way to get people coming back to comics. Um, and I personally like there being so many different ways we can go into these things, just because there are a lot of different storylines that don't seem wrong. I mean, we were talking about the like gatekeeping and things of that nature earlier. Um, you know, like there's already discourse about whether or not Michael B. Jordan's going to play Superman, which I don't know how I feel about that, but it's not because it's Michael B. Jordan, or it's not because it's a black Superman. It's because of other reasons. Because in a world, we've had a run, right? We've had Calvin Ellis, is that it? You know, we've had that before. And so the fact that we do have the ability to go through these things and use the inclusivity, because there's a lot of kids who look like me who were scared to pick up a comic because they never saw themselves in them. I think the more of that we have, the better. I think so. And this is more particularly to the big dogs, right? It's like your Marvels and your DCs, of having all these different timelines and universes and retcons, I think is useful in the long run because of that. But on the other hand, I'm kind of with Randy, where the small publishers are where it's at right now. There's so many cool, unique stories. And I think kind of the support of that is also equally as important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will agree that like in recent years, I've gotten more into a lot of the indies because a lot of it is shorter form storytelling without having to worry about continuity. And it's just, there's some just different stories there too. Oh, it's also good. I wish I could talk to you guys for forever. I have so many more questions for you. Maybe next year we can physically get together in a room and do something like this, and dive deeper with more time. But this is going to be the end of our panel. This video will be up on Cal's Facebook and Cal's Fletcher Library's Facebook. If you have any other questions that you'd like to ask, I can try to send out or answer for you. You can comment there. Thank you all, our panel, so much for your time and your generosity, because I know we've gone over a little bit. And thank you to everyone who took time to spend the time with us and ask so many great questions. I wish I could have gotten to them all, to be honest. And that'll do it. Thank you so much. Y'all have a good night.
Thank you for
All right.
yeah,
Thank you for this. Bye.
Bye, guys.